Before we get to this episode of the NAFI More Right Rudder podcast, I'd like to take a moment to thank this episode's sponsor, Lightspeed. Now, Lightspeed is offering a unique program with enhanced purchasing options solely to benefit you, the NAFI members. Take advantage of two cost savings options from Lightspeed, the Trade-Up program and the CFI Pro Pilot program. Get up to $600 off of one of their superior ANR headsets. Their special offer will allow NAFI CFIs to combine these unique programs into one opportunity for cost savings never offered before. To learn more, visit their site at go.lightspeedaviation.com/NAFI. Once again, that's go.lightspeedaviation.com/NAFI. You can also find this link in the show notes for this podcast. Or you can even contact them directly to take advantage of their NAFI membership benefit. Call 1-800-332-2421 or email them at support@lightspeedaviation.com. We thank them for their support of this podcast and, of course, this episode. And if you're not a NAFI member and this has intrigued you, remember, you can get a $10 off discount your NAFI membership or renewal using the code POD49, POD49 on checkout. We appreciate you listening to this episode, and if you haven't liked and subscribed to this podcast in anywhere you typically listen to them, please do. And remember, our website is nafinet.org. Thanks again for listening. Hi, I'm John Niehaus, Director of Program Development for the National Association of Flight Instructors. Welcoming you back to another episode of the NAFI More Right Rudder podcast, the podcast for flight instructors on the go. And today I have a special guest, and it's a continuation of a MentorLIVE presentation that we did last month on April 17th, and it was called Learning from Others' Mistakes. And so my guest today is David Moorefield. He is a former Naval Aviator. He specialized in teaching crew resource management in the military, Director of Flight Operations and Adjunct Professor for Embry-Riddle, a Cirrus Transition Instructor, and at one point was also a mechanic in the Air Force. Dave, welcome.
Hey, how you doing, John? Pleasure to be here.
Pretty good. Pretty good. Sounds like you've done a little bit of everything.
Yeah, kind of a little bit of a gypsy when it came to the military and, master or the jack of all trades, master of none, as we used to say.
Well, yeah, we were just joking about how it doesn't happen very often, or it doesn't seemingly happen very often about jumping from one branch to another.
Yeah, a little bit of a head scratcher. Well, I tell people that, and they're like, "So you went from a very, very nice life to living on a boat?" And I'm like, "Yeah."
I mean, adventure, right?
Lots of adventure, lots of scary nights over open ocean, but lots of adventure.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. So, this is a long time in the making. I mean, you and I have been talking about this stuff for months. I mean, this dates back into, I think, the end of last year. I'm so excited that we're having this discussion, and I'm really glad that you were able to do MentorLIVE back in April. The presentation, learning from others' mistakes. For those that haven't listened to the MentorLIVE episode, and hopefully, if you haven't, there is going to be a link in the show notes for this episode, so you can go back and listen to it. It was a great presentation, or watch it. Still qualifies for Wings credit if you're interested in that. Dave, can you give us just kind of a brief Cliff Notes version of that presentation without giving up too many spoilers for those that still want to watch?
Sure. The origins of that presentation really came out of what I used to do in the Navy when I was a CRM instructor. We used to go and go through all the accident reports and pull down mostly Navy accidents. But we'd bring in some accidents from the commercial realm. And it was interesting to go through those and look at those chain of events, if you will, the Swiss cheese, and kind of determine what the causal factors were for that. It was a great learning tool. But as I was going through this with my students, I kind of started figuring out, well, how can I use that methodology to drive home some of the points that we're trying to teach during their flight training phases, be it, in the instrument phase, if you're doing something for their cross country, their long cross country. What things are you trying to hammer home, and what points are you trying to get them to walk away with? So that's why I started doing that with some of my students, pulling down NTSB reports, going through those ports and parts that I said, okay, well, if we're learning about fuel and how to calculate fuel, what things in this accident led to that? And then I started figuring, well, you know what? I can kind of build my own scenarios using some of that information, collating all that information from the NTSB reports and building scenarios to fit what I want to teach. So that's kind of the genesis of how that all happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting because they always say that aviation learns from tragedy, right? We realize, well, okay, I guess we shouldn't have built it that way. Let's not do that again, and hopefully that
Right.
means that the airplane, continues to be much safer moving forward. Same thing with pilots. We make a mistake and go, all right, well, I guess we should probably teach not to do that. And we
Exactly.
move forward and get safer and so I definitely see us continuing that moving forward, and I think that the sort of the space tourism and all the things going on, they're learning from those mistakes as well. Um, so I think it's really interesting. Do you find as you are thinking about these kinds of scenarios, and of course they're kind of morose or sad, does the emotional aspect of that affect someone's learning as they're hearing about those tragedies, or, do you think that that enhances their ability to remember what you're trying to teach?
I think to a certain extent it enhances it because what it does is it kind of brings it home. When you explain how some of these people who made mistakes that cost them not only their lives, but a lot of times the lives of their family or their kids, it really, and it's for my students, many of them are older with families of their own that they're planning on flying with. It kind of brings it home to them as go, I really need to be careful. I need to watch that because I will be flying with my family. I will be flying with my wife, and
Hmm.
I don't want that to be me. And the purpose of it isn't to point out other people's failings. There but the grace of God go I. I mean, Lord knows how many mistakes I've made and everybody else has made. And,
Hmm.
thank God we walk away from those. But unfortunately, some of our compatriots didn't walk away from them. And I think to a person, if you were to ask them, they would probably say, you know what, I want somebody to learn from what happened to me. Because I freely admit when I make mistakes, and I even tell my students, yeah, I've done this in the past and it almost bit me. So you have to be very careful because I walked away unscathed, but other people didn't.
That's
So
an
I think it's a
interesting,
good learning tool.
yeah, that's an interesting point. As pilots, we tell those stories all the time. So in a way, we're kind of learning from each other in a scenario-based training standpoint, just in a much less formal way.
Right, right. And I think to a certain extent too, as pilots and aviators, you almost it's almost like a badge of honor. You almost walk away and those scabs develop. And when you talk to other people, when you talk to other people outside of aviation, you start talking about accidents and you do it in a very cold and calculating way. You're not doing it because you're a cold person, but you look at it from a very different perspective, as
Hmm.
opposed to somebody who's from outside that realm. It'd be like a doctor when you talk about a surgery and what they find. Most people, if they saw a surgeon go to work, they'd be, oh my God, they'd be mortified. But to him, that's the daily routine. I think for us as pilots and aviators, you live with that risk your whole life. And okay, there is risk involved what I do. What do I do to mitigate that? How do I impart that to other people so they don't make that mistake? And I think that's one of the things that we do as aviators very well. We're able to compartmentalize and look at things that are very cold, almost calculating ways, saying, okay, I won't do this because that will lead to this outcome.
Hmm.
And I think that's where we kind of differentiate a little bit. So to the outside viewer, it might seem like, oh my God, you're looking at accident reports. Yes, we are, but we're not doing it to make fun of people. We're doing it to learn from it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. My wife really hates watching those kinds of shows with me because I'm like, "Oh, I know this one, and this is what happens." She's like, "Ah, you just ruined it."
Yeah, today,
Um,
it was funny. I was teaching an AGI class this morning, and we were talking about microbursts. And so we were talking about the Delta flight that crashed in Dallas Fort Worth. And I said, this is the pivotal moment in aviation where we decide we need to do something about trying to find out how microbursts affect commercial aviation.
Yeah.
And so I ran the clip, and I'm looking at it. I'm stopping. You see here, this is what, this is the incident happened here. And, you can see some of the faces like, oh my God. But other people who are pilots are like, oh yeah, I could see that happening. I could see why they made that mistake. So,
Hmm. Well, and I mean, it's said that a certain amount of fear can be healthy fear as well. So, when you're looking at those things, you're like, well, okay, I'm now a little bit afraid of microbursts, but I guess that's probably a good thing. I'm
right.
not gonna mess with that. Um, so, kind of the idea again behind this is to sort of expand upon how do you go from sort of the idea of what kind of lessons you want to impart on a student. And then kind of almost probably walk your way backwards, right? You go, okay, here's the lesson, and then do you try to find an accident that sort of fits that, or do you generally have the accident in mind already and then work your way forward?
Well, generally, what I do is if I'm teaching a certain phase like inadvertent IMC, if I'm talking about, okay, if you go inadvertent IMC, and I want to show them, okay, standard rate turn, 180 degrees coming out, that's how you're going to get out of it. But I don't think they truly get and understand what that means and why that's important. So a lot of times, what I'll do is, okay, well, let me pull down an accident report and show you why this is, and
Hmm.
why it's really important to understand what inadvertent IMC is and how to get out of it. So you can find a plethora of those accidents on the NTSB reports. There are some others that go to, fuel starvation. Other accidents have a various numerous or various different outcomes and reasons for the accident. Icing is a good one. When you start talking about icing, and you talk about aircraft that have gotten to icing conditions, there's a bunch of NTSB reports you can pull down from that. If you can't, and sometimes you can't find one that really truly fits the scenario. So
Hmm.
then what I do is I start to make a scenario. I start to build out kind of a scenario, but then I kind of have an associated accident in mind. So I almost create an accident from numerous accidents. And the nice thing is when you do that, you can have a chain of events that you build upon, and you can work with them and have a pretty elaborate scenario as you're doing this with multiple tripwires in there, and ask them, okay, aerodynamic decision making. Okay, what was your ADM model? What were the things in here that you saw would have been the place where you said, okay, I'm at my decision point, I need to turn back, or you said they should have turned back at that point. So it kind of shows them and it illustrates that where they can turn back. And I think a lot of that is they don't know what they don't know.
Hmm.
As flight instructors, we go out there all the time and we've got to set the example for them to know, okay, that's not good. And I think a lot of times we get kind of into that, hey, we used to call it get the X in the Navy. And we got to get out of that get the X mentality, X meaning get the hop done. And kind of show them that it's important to step back and have safety in mind as paramount as much as possible. And I think that's where we need to really kind of, bring in the reins a little bit.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, and I want to circle back to that in just a second. But as far as the scenario is concerned, when you build them, and you have kind of those tripwires, how far does each of those individual spokes go? So, for example, let's say you have a straight line, and you get to the first point, and say there's two or three different choices and they make the wrong choice. Do you build the scenario to continue into that wrong choice to see how far they'll go? Like, can they get back to the original line? Or is it like, okay, here's the teaching moment. We're going to talk about this, and then let's go back to the straight line again. How complex do these get?
Uh, when I first start out, they don't get as complex, but as we go down the rabbit hole, as they get further and further into training, I try to make them more complex because I really want them to start thinking, and I want them to start thinking about scenario even before they get in the airplane. So what happens is, say for instance, I built one out not long ago. It was talking about, and this was based on a couple of different reports. Actually, I kind of use myself almost as a test subject on that. What basically I said, okay, there's a pilot who's going out to Pensacola for a reunion with some of his friends that he was in a squadron with. He's leaving from Daytona Beach. He's going to bring his family with him. They get in a car. They're driving out. His wife says, "Hey, I forgot to bring the present I'm bringing to Kathy when we get out there. We need to turn back." the idea was for them to have an 8 o'clock, 8 a.m. departure to fly out there. Now they're delayed by 2 hours. They get to the airport. When they get to the airport, the plane isn't completely fueled. So they've got to wait for fuel, and it's really busy at the airport. So it's taking them another hour to get a fuel truck out there. So you can see the compounding effect of what's
Hmm.
happening. And
Hmm.
now what happens is I say, okay, that pilot's rushed. He didn't update his weather. So now the weather he had initially in that morning is 3 hours old. Never went back to look at the new weather reports, didn't look at the winds aloft again, and takes off. Takes off in a clear blue sky, but climbs up to 5,000 feet. And the next thing you know, he's hitting stronger headwinds than he anticipated. Well, he didn't have as much fuel because what he had to do was take less fuel because he had heavier weights. He had his wife, his daughter, he had, luggage. So he had to defuel the airplane in order to get off the ground to make sure he was within weight and balance. So you
Hmm.
start to see you can start building some of those tripwires. And one of the things I'll ask them is, well, at what point should he have said, let me go back and reevaluate this? And I tell him the point that he knew he had to turn back home to pick up that present, he should have said, okay, let me go back and take 5, 10, 20 minutes and reevaluate where I'm at in my decision-making process and go back and check the weather. Is this still a good idea to go do that? And
Hmm.
if you step back, a lot of times you'll start seeing, hey, this isn't a good idea because we all get those little hairs on the back of your neck stand up and you go, something's not right here. Well, I bet you probably 99% of the people before they had an accident had that inclination. And a really good rule of thumb is I call it the three strike rule. If you're late, you get to the airport, you got to get something with the tire done. You got to do something with fuel. Weather doesn't look so great. You got your three strikes, live to fly another day. I mean, that is truly my mantra for my students. Live to fly another day. Because there is always another day as long as you're on the ground, wishing you're up there, instead of being up there, wishing you're on the ground.
I 100% agree, and I like the term "get the X" because I think that it does describe pilots, right? We are mission-based people. We want to get the job done, and that's pilots anywhere from student and private pilots all the way up to corporate and airline pilots. They all feel that pressure, sometimes in different ways, but the idea of I want to do this, whether it's even just you pushing yourself into it. In your position, with all of the experience that you have in teaching this kind of thing, obviously that type of hazardous attitude has persisted, probably from the beginning all the way to now. Um, do you see that attitude starting to get trained out, or is it still a as consistent of an issue as, what maybe you saw back in the military years and years ago?
I think it's starting to evolve and get trained out. But the one thing about pilots is, I mean, we're pilots. We're egotistical. I mean,
Right.
when I stopped flying helicopters, my last flight in a helicopter, I do remember I was looking at this young lady who was flying with. She's a great pilot. We landed, and they bring out the water buckets and they wet you down with the water buckets because it's your last flight. And I just looked at her as we were taxiing. I said, "Well, I'm just a mere mortal today," because as a pilot, you feel great. I mean, it's an accomplishment. No matter what you're doing, be it military, civilian, private pilot, it doesn't matter. You worked your butt off to get that pilot rating, and it's a great accomplishment. So we
Hmm.
all have a little bit of bravado. We all have a little bit of, hey, I'm better than the other guy. And as pilots, we're competitive. We have that type A personality. We're very competitive, which is good. It makes you be competitive. It makes you want to go out there. It makes you want to a certain extent, push the envelope. But the trick is knowing exactly where that envelope becomes dangerous and where you operate safely within that envelope. And
Hmm.
I think that's the attitudes that we need to kind of rein in sometimes because, we'll look at weather and go, oh, that should be okay. And as I've gotten older and I've flown through more and more nasty weather, I'm like, you know what? Why? Why do I have to do that? Why do I have to bring that student up there and show them? Because there are some people that have of the mindset that we should go up there and show your students what the bad weather looks like so they don't fly in it. My view on that is if I do that, I'm reinforcing to that student that one day they'll be able to handle it and go into it before they might be ready to do it. And they can go, well, my flight instructor was ready at this point. So at some point in my career, I should be ready to do it. The
Hmm.
message we should be sending is no, you shouldn't want to do that. You should say, okay, that doesn't look good. I'm going to live to fly another day. I'm going to go ahead and just push this till tomorrow, and I'll make alternate plans. And I think if we do that, we kind of start breaking the cycle of, hey, I can do anything. I'm Superman.
Yeah, and so when you look at these scenarios and you look at attitudes, because attitudes are an interesting thing. I mean, certainly they can be applied to just about any situation, similar to what you just said. Okay, I've got a hazardous attitude of invulnerability. I'm not afraid of weather. I'm not afraid of short runways, whatever that might be. Do you find that using scenarios for attitudes versus like specific aircraft situations is easier or harder to build and sort of get your point across?
Well, for specific environmental or mechanical situations, it's actually pretty easy to build those out,
Yeah.
because you can put in all the parameters you want for that. The one that's really hard and nuanced is the attitude, right? That's the
Hmm.
one where, because everybody's attitude they have an individual attitude, so it's not a cut and dry. So my idea of what's dangerous might be different to what your idea of dangerous might be,
True.
and it's also kind of a sliding scale, right? So my comfort level for certain things might be higher or lower than your comfort level. And you might have a tons of experience doing certain things. Like, for example, flying a helicopter off the back of a ship at 3 o'clock in the morning with no MVGs. People would go, "That's absolutely nuts." You know, when I was a lieutenant, I was like, "That's just normal. That's what I did every morning." Three
Yeah.
o'clock in the morning, I'd launch off the ship. So to me, it wasn't hazardous because I knew exactly what I was doing. To the average person going out on a ship and doing that maybe the first time, go, "You're insane. You're nuts. I'm not doing that." So I think that's the difference, is trying to figure out, okay, what's the threshold for people in that hazardous attitude? Because maybe what your training has enabled you to do doesn't make it a hazardous attitude, but we have to marry that to the level of training they're doing to go, well, that is kind of a hazardous attitude because you don't have the training to go beyond that point.
Yeah.
And that's where it becomes kind of difficult to do it. The mechanical and the other parts that you can put into, like the icing and those things, those are kind of hard and fast things. But the
Hmm.
the nuanced one is really the hazardous attitudes.
Well, and I know that in the Mentor Live presentation, you incorporated kind of some risk management ideas and things that you had pulled from the FAA in that regard. Let's talk a little bit about risk management. You know, it's obviously an important subject. It's something that the FAA has really been focusing on, and it works. It lends itself well to scenario based training. But how do you truly teach a pilot to mitigate risk? How does that come together? I mean, it's it seems concrete when you think about it, but then when you try to explain it, it's kind of like, that cornstarch and water where you try to hold on to it and it just kind of slips through your fingers. What kind of techniques do you use for that?
Uh, one of the things I really like to do is I'm a big kind of weather geek. I taught weather meteorology when I was in the Navy too, as one of the ground syllabuses I taught, and I was fascinated by it. And like I said, I've been caught in some pretty nasty weather. So one of the things I really like to do is, for the risk management part, is to use weather as kind of the entering argument for the risk management, and how to kind of judge what your risk is and what tolerable risk is, and how to mitigate that risk. So, for instance, if in cross country, a perfect example, going cross country out to Pensacola. Well, what I try to do is I'll tell them, okay, if I'm going cross country to Pensacola, say in October, there's a much different scenario base for that as opposed to going cross country to Pensacola in July, because of thunderstorms and how they pop up and kind of weather you're going to encounter. So what I'll do is I'll say, if I was going to take that flight in, say, October, what kind of risk would I be facing weather wise, and how would I mitigate that risk? And most of the time, when you show them those weather patterns, you can historically bring down weather patterns and show them what it looks like. Outside of the hurricanes, you can say, okay, weather's probably going to be fairly pleasant. It won't be too hot, and you're probably not going to see a whole lot in the way of thunderstorms, as opposed to, say, July. In July, what are you going to see? Well, in July, you're going to see a lot more thunderstorms. Okay, true, but when will those thunderstorms start to pop up? Well, those thunderstorms will probably start hitting, popping up around noon, 1 o'clock. And I'll say, okay, well, if you think about how you're going to plan for that and mitigate any risk if you have to do or decide to go in July, what would your tripwires be? Well, could it be something in effect where I say, well, I'm going to start my flight as early as possible, 6 o'clock in the morning, because that way I'm starting in the coolest part of the day without any threat of thunderstorms initially. And
Hmm.
then I'm going to say what I'll look at is like flying to Tallahassee. Once I get to Tallahassee, I can land in Tallahassee, double check my weather, make sure the remaining segment of my route is good. If it's not, I can wait the thunderstorms out at that point because they should blow through, and I can go ahead and press on to Pensacola from there, about an hour or so worth of a flight, and I can do that just before sunset and still be in Pensacola that day and not wreck my crew day. So that's how I kind of work that scenario and go, there are other options available to you, but you build in those tripwires, you start thinking about what the atmosphere is going to be for that season. Because again, if you look back at some of these reports, NTSB reports, weather is one of the hugest factors that causes people to go into the ground,
Hmm.
and not doing a good job of looking at the weather and planning around the weather. And down here, obviously, that's huge for thunderstorms in the summer. Planning for like up in the north when I flew up in New York, it was icing and snow and things like that. So you're always planning for that. Where you're at, same thing. You're always having to plan on icing, what level the icing's freezing levels are at. So different areas are going to have different things to be concerned about. A nice thing to do is to take them from, like, I'll take them from Daytona in a scenario up into Georgia, northern part of Georgia in winter, and even into like North Carolina, Virginia. If you do that, then you've got, okay, we're starting off down here, but what do you got to deal with going up there? Totally different environment they're dealing with, one they haven't dealt with before, and pulling those weather reports down and start looking at those, prognostic charts saying, well, you're going to have some IFR conditions and there's precip. So what do you have to think about? And then they start thinking about their way through it and figuring out, okay, what are my other actions that I can take as part of my risk management strategy?
I mean, that's really, it's really good training. Have you ever taken any of these scenarios and you talked about like, okay, well, I ask them to put themselves in that situation in icing in New York or something like that. Have you ever taken these types of scenarios and then built them into like a simulator event or any of that kind of stuff and
Yeah.
had them sort of in a almost real world or at least as real as it could be type of event and walk them through the same kind of scenario while they're actually in the hot seat? Does that work or is that too much pressure?
No, I think a simulator is actually a great place to do that. As a matter of fact, as part of what we teach and what I do for our high school classes is I've built out what we call simulator labs. Now those are actually for the training purposes, but I'm in the process of building out scenarios that will incorporate those very things in a simulator to do that type of instruction to show them, okay, well, so for instance, what happens if I go out there and all of a sudden I am inadvertent IMC and I'm a VFR pilot. Now what do I do?
Hmm.
And there's certain simulators like we work with Gleim and Redbird. Both of them are great companies.
Hmm.
And the nice thing about both of them is, excuse me, they can put in failures, or you can start taking that fuel down, because now you can say, okay, you're going a little bit faster, but a little slower. Got a big strong headwind. Did you plan on that? And see exactly where they start to figure out, oh wait, I've got to start doing that, because you go, well, what do you think your ground speed is? If you got a G1000, it's going to tell you what your ground speed is. So you
Yeah.
can look right over there and go, oh, I had calculated ground speed supposed to be 100 knots, and I've got a ground speed of 70 knots. And
Yeah.
then you can kind of go, all right, well, how's that going to affect your fuel? And then you start that mental process of, okay, well, now what do I have to do? So it's a great way to do it. That simulator training is a great way to kind of drive the point home in an environment that puts a little bit of stress on it, but is very safe still.
Right. And it's interesting that you brought up the medical field earlier, because my first sort of toe dip into, true CRM, but also kind of in a professional environment, just out of college, I was part of a research grant through Western Michigan University, my alma mater. And the whole point behind the research grant was to take aviation crew resource management techniques and apply them to the medical field.
Yeah,
So the main principal on the grant was faculty at Western, and he also came from United, where of course CRM sort of was designed. And what we used to do is we developed a bunch of these medical scenarios. A lot of them were focused around heart attack situations. And we would go and do them in the hospitals, which is crazy. We had actors, and sometimes we would start out at a diner, and the person would just be, "Oh, I don't feel well. I'm hot. Whatever." And it would be, "Okay, this person's now going to the EMTs. The EMTs are transferring to the hospital. The hospital is transferring to the operating room." And we would record all of this. And then there'd be a big debrief the next day with all of the different departments going, "Okay, here's a breakdown in communication. Did you guys see this?" And it was the conversation for that was amazing because sometimes you'd go, "Well, um, we saw this," and the EMT would say, "Well, in the past, the operating room or whatever hasn't wanted to hear this bit of details." And you go, "Okay." So you talk to them and say, "How come, would this have, if you had known this, would this have affected something?" "Oh, yeah." And the point I'm trying to get to is that, like you said, that they learn from the same types of failures. But also the main sort of takeaway from that is you never let the patient die, right?
Right.
Because there's a certain amount of stress that you get to that is good stress. But then if for some reason you let them go down that rabbit hole so far that the patient dies, doctors, just like pilots, all of a sudden, that's all they can focus on, right?
Right.
It's not about the situation. It's not about what happened. It's, "Oh my God, this was the negative effect that led to, something bad happening." And so, whenever I train other instructors, especially those that are going to be using simulators and stuff, because those types of things are fun to do. Like, "Oh, well, let's do a frozen pitot tube. Let's do a frozen static port. Let's do icing and all these things." It's great to a point, and then if for some reason it was a catastrophic situation, I learned from that project that you pause it before something really bad happens, because again, that pilot stops learning the moment that screen goes red.
Right.
And I'm sure that you've encountered that same kind of stuff, probably both at Embry, but also in the military as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a point where, yeah, and as instructors, you try to figure out, okay, what's the point I let them go to before it's too far? One for me, but one for them, right? So
Hmm.
we're pretty good at understanding the point we let them go to, that we know we can recover the aircraft from. But the problem one of the issues that comes about with that is if you go too far and you you scare them into shutting down and not understanding and listening, because now they're in that flight or fight mode, right? They're in survival mode. Their body
Exactly.
would just got shocked and like, oh, wow, I almost died. Like if they do a stall and you say, okay, you could see that the stall is uncoordinated, you're going to start to spin, and you go, I'm going to let this go. I'm going to show them what happens. Well, that can be good down the road if they've seen a couple of stalls and they know that they're not going to fall out of the sky. But the first time, if you show them a stall and let them do it, and you let it go into a spin, you've shut them down because now they're terrified, and a lot of
Hmm.
them do get terrified by that. So whenever I do that kind of thing, I always tell them, I pre-brief that. I say, okay, listen, I'm going to show you what this looks like coordinated, and this is what the aircraft will do in coordinated stall. The noses are going to want to fall through. That's all it's going to happen. It's not going to be violent. You're not going to start spinning as long as you're coordinated. And I'll make sure that when they're doing that stall, that they are coordinated. I don't let them go uncoordinated, because I don't want them to be scared. I want them to be
Right.
comfortable to know that, okay, I can recover this aircraft. There's plenty of room down the road to show them, okay, now you get some flights on your belt, you're more comfortable. Then you can say, okay, now we're going to show you what that looks like when you stall the aircraft uncoordinated and get into a spin. So you do see that quite a bit. But again, it's that fine line, because you want them to have a little bit of that fear, I guess, is for lack of a better term, because you learn from that. But you don't want to the point where it stifles them and it doesn't, and they shut down, because then they don't learn. And you
Hmm.
don't want that. You want them to learn, to walk away with that, with a healthy respect, going, "Wow, that was not good," knowing full well that you were in a position that you could take the aircraft. We used to call it circle of fear. And so as an instructor in T-34, we had to stick. So as you're flying with that student, your hand was like, around the stick like this. So your circle of fear was really close. And as you got close, more and more comfortable with that student, your circle of fear expanded. but then, they do something, the circle of fear came right back. So you're always, your circle of fear kind of ebbed and flowed. And it depended on what you were teaching. If you were teaching aerobatics, formation, your circle of fear kind of, again, ebbed and flowed with that student. But that was good. It's healthy for you to have that as an instructor, have that kind of that level of fear or anxiety, like, to enough to go, that keeps you alive. Because when
Yeah.
you get too complacent, that's the thing that kills you. And never believe your own press. I mean, if a lot of us get to the point, and I fight that all the time, because you're flying with people like, hey, you're a great pilot. You're like, yeah, I might be good, but you know what? I could still die. No matter how good you are, it
Yeah.
doesn't matter. You could have 20,000 hours. And matter of fact, look at some of the accident reports. You see airline pilots at 20,000 hours die,
Hmm.
in GA aircraft. And you're thinking to yourself, well, how could that happen? You know, Everybody makes mistakes. It doesn't matter how many hours you've got. You make mistakes. We all do. And the thing is, don't get to the point in your career where you go, "What? It's no problem. I've got 20,000 hours. I can handle that." Yeah, that's the time to kill yourself, or
Hmm.
worse, somebody else. Um, Snodgrass, an F-14, like, phenomenal pilot, died in a GA aircraft, just recently. Well, the AOPA gentleman who died in an aircraft. I mean, you're talking about people who've got thousands and thousands of hours and tons of experience. Not, I mean, fantastic pilots, but it
Hmm.
just takes that one mistake or that one time that something happens and we're paying attention. And that can happen to any of us. And so that's why I am always guarded on that. I never believe my own press. You
Yeah.
know, it's important.
The other thing as I was listening to you talk, I'm curious about, we talk about using scenarios to try to teach out hazardous attitudes. Do you find any effectiveness in using scenarios to reinforce positive attributes? So let's say somebody is scared of something. Are you able to use a scenario to build confidence where otherwise maybe there was a lack of?
Yeah, so I guess, and again, you kind of using that, the weather
Yeah.
as that guide. When you show them, okay, if I were to use that scenario going out to Pensacola, and I said, okay, well, if I did encounter thunderstorms, or I did see those thunderstorms, and I planned accordingly, okay, I planned for my VFR checkpoints to be either over or as close to airports as possible. So that way, and if I hit bad weather, almost every one of my checkpoints is an airport. So I can duck into an airport if I'm on a VFR flight plan very easily and escape the weather.
Hmm.
So at that point, it alleviates some of that fear and anxiety going, oh, okay, I'm not going to be in the middle of, the Gulf trying to find, an airport or someplace to land. Almost every place I go, I'm 10 or 15 miles from an airport. Boom, I got an escape route. Build the relief valve in and go, well, what can you do to do that? And that's a good way for you to show them, okay, so I do have a wall right there in Tallahassee. Well, can I land at Lake City? Well, yeah, I can land at Lake City. Well, there you go. There's my out. And Lake City is a nice airport. You go to the FBO, shut it down, wait for the weather to pass, and off you go.
Hmm.
So there's a way that you can incorporate some relief valves in the training to show them and alleviate some of that stress. And then they start to realize, oh, okay, so I can do it during the summer as long as I'm safe. I know exactly when to fly, and I've got my checkpoints or relief valves built in. So if the weather does turn bad on me, I have a way to get out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see how weather being as dynamic as it is can lead to a lot of really good conversations about a multitude of different things.
Yeah, weather's a fantastic way to use it. I mean, the other, and weather kind of leads you to a whole host of different, other effects too, like fuel, because weather
Hmm.
changes, the wind changes, so it leads to discussions about fuel. It leads to discussion about, okay, if I win inadvertent IMC, it leads to discussion about possible icing. There's a host of things that you can start with weather that kind of, dovetail in other areas that you can build that scenario around and hit a whole bunch of stuff that you're trying to get a point across on, in that one or two scenarios.
So out of the scenarios that you've built for your students over the days, and I know you mentioned that you have got a Google Drive full of all of these things, um, which one do you find you use the most?
Um, Probably for me, I mean, as you can tell, the weather is a big one for me because
Right.
I think for our environment down here, um, we're always constantly concerned about weather in Florida, thunderstorms,
Yeah.
things of that nature. So that really is probably one of the ones I really like the most. And also too, like I said, kind of being a little bit of a weather geek. I enjoy that. I mean, I love going out and watching thunderstorms. I just think they're fascinating. So to me, I enjoy bringing those scenarios out. And it's funny because my students, they're kind of now they've become kind of like weather geeks. And they used to laugh at me because, I'd be flying and we'd be up in the pattern. And I would say, I'd be, there's a thunderstorm that's getting ready to move in. I'm like, okay, we've got about another 10 minutes and that thing's going to be right on top of us. And lo and behold, we do two turns in the pattern. That's okay. Let's go ahead and taxi and shut it down because probably by the time we get in, we're going to get wet, almost without fail. Exactly what happened. They will look at me
Yeah.
like, "What are you, some sort of oracle?" I'm like, "No, I know enough about the weather around here that I know what that's going to do."
Right.
So
So, but that's your favorite like subject matter, but do you have one, I guess maybe a better question is, do you have one based off of say an accident report? Is there one that you tend to use more than others in terms of, the different classroom aspects that you teach or
there's one that comes to mind, and well, the Kobe Bryant one's a good one.
yeah,
Um,
that is a good one.
that's a really good one to pull that one down, because that has so many red lights in it. You're like, wow, okay, why? Didn't
Mm.
have to be. There's a couple of GA ones that I like that are, um, and I think it's one in Georgia, and I can't remember it off the top of my head. I have to pull it down, but that one's a good one because that one is going from like Florida to Georgia and going from the very flat terrain with one weather pattern up into a mountainous terrain. And again, invert IMC. And what happened was they got disoriented and went into a mountain. And it was amazing because they got low ceilings and didn't have to be that way. And it was a kind of a low time pilot, brand new IFR rated, didn't have a whole lot of experience in IFR. So that one is good because what that allows you to do is start talking about, we all have personal minimums, right?
Hmm.
So it allows you to tell them, okay, personal minimums are there for a reason. Use them. And I've got one of my students getting ready for his instrument check ride here in the next month or two. Very good about that. And he and I talked repeatedly. He was supposed to have a check ride this past week, and we were sitting talking about the weather. And I was like, you know what? Those gusts are going to be way too much. He's like, yeah, I agree. I'm going to push it. But that's one of those things. And it was to his personal minimums because we
Mm.
started talking about what are your personal minimums. And he was asking me, well, is that something that's a set number for me my whole career? And I said, no, it's not. Your personal minimums will ebb and flow because what's going to happen is if you fly a lot, okay, and you're flying around here, doing a lot of IFR flights, your personal minimums will probably come down a little bit. So instead of saying, okay, my ceiling limit's going to be 3,000, my ceiling limit might be 2,000 or 1,500, and my wind envelope's going to expand a little bit. I might go for that 8 knot crosswind as opposed to a 5 knot crosswind. So it will ebb and flow. Now, if you haven't flown IFR for a long time, you want to make that personal minimum go back out.
Mhm.
You don't want to shrink it. You want to bring it back out and allow yourself to have that. Again, it's that tripwire for you. It's that safety valve where you go, you know what? I'm sticking to this. And a lot of DPs are very good about that. They'll tell you, okay, let me see your personal minimums. And the great DPs, in my opinion, great DPs will go, well, that personal minimum you have today, is that good for us to fly? And it's funny because you know the story of how many students like, well, get the X, right? How many students
Mhm.
go, well, yeah, but I mean, it's a check flight. I want to get it done. And
Especially in these days when they're
yeah,
4 months out.
exactly. So a good DP can go, no, no, your personal minimum is what? So that's that learning moment where they got to go, look, the personal minimum is there for a reason. And I think that's a great scenario to use it for.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you ever use the JFK Junior flight for any of the
Oh yeah,
scenarios? Because
yeah,
I know that's a good one. I mean,
yes,
good of a scenario as could be again,
right,
knowing that
right.
it's a tragedy, but
Well, what I'll do is, and I've done this with just almost every one of my students. I'm very comfortable flying over the water because I did it for years in the Navy. So off the coast of St. Augustine, we'll go out and I'll say, okay, at night we'll fly out off the coast, and I'll say, let's go fly out towards that light. And I was just talking to class about this today. So as we're flying out, and invariably what happens, right? All of a sudden the aircraft starts doing this. And I go, okay, let's go wings level. And they look at me, and they go, I am wings level. Like, no, look at your attitude gyro. I'm like, oh man. So I go back wings level. I said, okay. About 5 minutes later, let's go back to wings level. I I am wings level. I'm like, no, you're not. So, and sometimes they'll get them pretty far out, and I'm like, okay, I've got controls, and I'll bring them around. I bring them back towards the shoreline. I said, now, fly back over there, and it's a very uncomfortable feeling when they do that because it shows them just how quickly they lose situational awareness. And
Hmm.
again, that's a great training aid. But then you can bring up that JFK report and say, okay, here's what happens when you don't have that proficiency, when you don't have that nighttime environment that you've flown in quite a bit. I mean, even for me, I haven't flown nighttime in a long time. And if I go fly nighttime, it's going to be day into night, and it's going to be a very bright moon when I go do it.
Yeah.
I ain't flying in dark anymore if I don't have to. But that's my safety valve, and I know what my limitations are, and I'm going to go up with somebody who is night current to make sure that they've got my back until I feel comfortable. Even though
Yeah.
I've got a ton of hours, I'm still going to have somebody with me to go, okay, watch me, get my back on this because I haven't flown night in a long time.
Yeah. Well, and all of this aside, it's really good experience to be able to think based on these scenarios because of course we know that the push from the FAA is that check rides are supposed to be scenario based and I remember years ago I was actually flying 135, and so I was there for a 6 month 135 check, which is basically a check ride. And the examiner there, really, really nice and knowledgeable guy, was trying to accomplish this scenario mission, and he had built these very complicated scenarios. And I just remember sitting at the table and he was asking me these questions about the Learjet, and he's like, "So here's what's going on." And I just remember looking at him going, "Okay." Struggling to figure out. I knew he had a point, and I just couldn't find it. And
Right.
it was he was trying to needle into just a very specific spot, and I could get there if he gave me enough details. But when you're sitting there trying to figure out exactly what he's trying to talk about, I mean, okay, it could be a half a dozen things, but I don't want to say which one it could be because
Right.
I don't know what we're talking about. And so, for your students to be exposed to this type of thing early on, I think is a really advantageous position for them to be in.
Yeah, and to that point, you don't want to make the scenarios so convoluted, especially when they're first starting out, right? You don't want to make
Yeah.
them so convoluted that they're like, I don't even know what you're trying to get at.
Yeah.
Because and that can happen, and that can happen very easily. I try to build it so it's very sequential, that everything leads to the next event, and
Hmm.
when it does that, that it's very apparent what I'm trying to get at when I build that for the next event, because there's branches to that. Okay, I make a decision A or decision B. Well, if I make decision A, what does decision A mean? Well, the decision A might be where I land at Lake City and I wait the weather out. And now, okay, you've done that. What do you have to do to make sure that the next leg is safe? Or decision B is I press on. Okay, you pressed on. Now I start building in some more factors like, okay, well, now you've encountered stronger headwinds. What's happening to your fuel? Going back to the earlier statement, well, hey, I had to take less fuel because I got more baggage of people with me.
Hmm.
Well, did you plan on that if you had more headwind? So it dovetails it and lends itself very nicely to branching the scenarios out and having different conversations about that. Because one brings you into a fuel conversation, one brings you back to a weather conversation and planning conversation, and what to think about with that. And then you can bring in all kinds of different rules and regulations too. Okay, so what are my limitations? If it's daytime, I'm flying VFR. How much fuel do I have to have, reserve fuel? Oh, well, if I'm flying day VFR that turns into night and I didn't plan accordingly, well, did I just break a rule because now I'm my reserve is not 30, it's 45 minutes. How did that work? So it allows you to bring in a whole host of things and ask a lot of questions just by a couple different branches in those scenarios.
Yeah. Do you ever convince them like, okay, so here's the scenario, and they go, okay, sweet. Well, I would land right here. Do you ever get to a point where you're like, well, let's say you make a bad decision and you keep going. Then what? Like, do you ever get them to just go, all right, that was the right choice, but let's keep going anyways?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, it's fun to see if they're gonna. It's fun to see if they're gonna stick to their guns, right?
Yeah.
Because so many times in aviation, you can get talked out of, and you could talk yourself out of something that was the right decision. You
Yeah.
know, because again, it goes to that bravado, right? How many times if you were in a situation going to Pensacola and it said, "Hey, get there, get home ice. I want to get there. It's going to be fun. It's going to be a great time." And all of a sudden you go, weather's looking a little bit worse than I thought, but you know what? I think I can do it when really you're inside something's telling you need to go to Lake City, you need to land there, you know. And it's that inner monologue that's pushing against yourself, going, okay, I could probably go there, but you know what, I think I could press on. Well, the same thing, you know, you can call that out of it a little bit and go, well, okay, so you decide to press on. Well, was that a good decision? And just watch them, because then they're like, well, I don't know, I think it was a good decision. And go, okay, well, explain to me why you think it's a good decision,
Yeah.
you know. Or if they landed at Lake City, then you can have them second guess themselves and go, well, why did you think landing at Lake City was a good decision? And the more confident they are about that answer because they've thought through it, the better you can realize I taught them right. I taught
Yeah.
them well. Because if they can look at you and say, I landed at Lake City because that was the safest decision that allowed me to make the most educated decision on whether or not I go forward. Because I could check weather, I can get fuel, I can wait the weather out. So if they can articulate that back to me, then I go, I did my job. They
Yeah.
thought about safety first.
It's funny. One of the things that I did with my students, and I did this with a first officer once when we had a emergency situation. Sometimes I look at it and go, okay, I don't want to do this. So your job is to convince me why we should. Or here's what I want to do, and your job is to convince me why we shouldn't. In one case, it was, we were in a multi-engine aircraft, and we had some indications saying that something was going bad in one of the engines, and the checklist led us down this decision tree that was very unclear. It was okay in this case, you shut it down. In this case, you ignore it. If it's a combination of this or this, who knows? And I remember looking at my co-pilot and saying, okay, the safest thing I think is to shut it down because what's the worst that's going to happen? We're going to fly single engine. We know the airplane can do it. We're going to land. We train for this all the time. It's no big deal. However, I don't want to shut this thing down. I'd rather not do any of this. But if we don't shut it down, we could have, equipment malfunctions. We could start a fire. We could, destroy the engine itself if we let it run too long. So I remember looking at my co-pilot saying, give me a good reason why I should not shut this airplane down. And, that led to a very good abbreviated discussion. It felt like an eternity, but I think it ended up being about a minute and a half. That led to some really good CRM, and those are the techniques that I learned from my instructors. So I think that you're really passing on some valuable knowledge to these students, and I think that they're going to be better than all the rest of us. So then that's what we all want, right? We want our
Yeah.
students to be better than us.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I hope so. That's the goal.
as we start to wind down this discussion, was there anything else about kind of expanding upon your presentation from last month that we haven't talked about? Any other points that you'd like to bring up or mention?
Um, yeah, I guess the biggest thing is, it's going to be it's going to be very much tailored to the instructor and the student, right? Because as an instructor, you know your students, you know them very well, and you get to know what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and that's the thing. And I use those scenarios, and you want to use those scenarios to really hone in on the areas that they're weak on and help them with that and help them think through those things. The areas they're strong on, you can still touch on those and use the scenarios. But those are the ones that really lend themselves to making them think through the whole decision making process, the ADM process, thinking through systems. That's another great thing. You can use those things and think through the system. and say, okay, well, if this happens, if I start getting some erroneous, my prop starts, fluctuating, what could it be? What are my decisions once that happens? If I get surges, what am I going to do? So that's some of the ways you can build it into the scenario using the system if they're weak. Um, so that's what I would say. It's a big thing that you want to make sure you understand where the strengths and weaknesses are with your student and kind of really tailor it to them. It's not kind of a one size fits all. And then the nice thing is if you've got multiple students, have a group discussion. A lot of these things that I would do, we would get on a Zoom call and we would go through as a group. There's about 6 or 7 of us, that were my students, and we'd work through these scenarios. It was great to hear other students talk about what they would do and what they
Mhm.
thought, because they start learning from each other that way too. So that's a great methodology when you have a bunch of them doing it, and it becomes fun because then they start putting different spins on it and go, well, I would do it this way, or did you think about this? And I learned stuff from them too all the time. They would go out there and dig stuff up like, wow, that's pretty cool. I didn't even think about that.
Right.
So as an instructor, you start learning even more by doing it, which is really fantastic because when your students make you learn, you become a better instructor to begin with. So it's a win-win across the board when you do it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think that in addition to that, for the new instructors out there who feel kind of overwhelmed by this entire idea, I think a lot of them, will look at this and go, yeah, this is a great idea, a great plan, but I'm new. How do I start this? And I think that, again, circling back to the very beginning of all of this, um, remembering that you have the resource to go in and look at the accident investigations and the accident reports and things like that. You have those tailored scenarios based on, the different types of things that you've described. You have those at your fingertips. So if you're not quite ready from an experiential standpoint to sort of quantify those types of situations in your own words, you've got a template already there for you. And again, as you mentioned, and I think rightfully so, especially if it were me, hopefully not. If something I did led to a situation that ends up in a report like that, I would hope that someone else would learn from it and not be able to repeat it. So use that as a framework, use that as a guide, so that you have something tangible and then you can kind of mold it into what you want. So I think, Dave, that's a genius place to start and a great place for new instructors to really, tailor their craft.
Yep, absolutely.
So I think that's all the points I have. Any final thoughts before we part ways?
No, it's been a pleasure. I really, really enjoy, talking to instructors about this. I learn as much from new instructors as they learn from me. One of the things I used to tell my students is, you're never as good as you are as the day you took your check ride.
Yeah.
So brand new instructors, man, they are great. They know the regs, they know all that stuff. And the thing is, my students, we'd go flying, and I've got the skills I've built up over the years, but they'd ask me some stuff on regs. I'm like, all right, I gotta go find that again. I can't remember off the top of my head, and I would tell him, I said, you know what? Go ask that young kid over there, because I'll tell you what, that kid is sharp as all get out because he just became a CFI. And so, for the old dogs out there, talk to those young kids because they're good. They are
Hmm.
good. They know the regs. They're great with that, and they're going to pick your brain too, because what they want to know is they want to know how to get better. I mean, they're fantastic. They're very knowledgeable, but they want to know how to get better. And that's where
Mhm.
we come in. We've got the experience to show them, okay, this is what you're going to see out there. This is how you can kind of guard against it. Those are the things they need in their toolbox. They've got the rules, the regs. They know how to do the procedures. They know exactly what those procedures look like. But for us, we should pass down to them, here's the things that are going to get you in trouble and may even kill you.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we have to do as more senior flight instructors, impart to them, and keep that dialogue going because they want to hear our stories. We want to talk to them. We want to hear what their aspirations are and what their stories are, and help them along the route. So that's the way we do it. Pay it forward.
Absolutely. I can't think of a better way to end this podcast than those words. So with that, David, I really appreciate you taking the time this evening to talk to me and to expound upon learning from others' mistakes, the Mentor Live from April.
All right. Awesome, John. It's great to be here.